Olá, pessoal. Meu nome é Eduarda. Eu sou estudante de Psicologia da Universidade Estadual de Maringá e vim apresentar um pouco para vocês do Laboratório de Psicologia Histórico-Cultural e o nosso novo projeto que chama Entrevistas com os Clássicos da Psicologia Histórico-Cultural. O Laboratório de Psicologia Histórico-Cultural é vinculado ao Departamento de Psicologia da Universidade Estadual de Maringá, a UEM, e tem como objetivo aprofundar discussões e estudos no interior da psicologia histórico-cultural, em especial dos seus clássicos. Sendo assim, o laboratório busca reunir e consolidar atividades de ensino, pesquisa e extensão que se preocupam com o desenvolvimento da abordagem. O grupo de estudos de LAPSIHC conta com alunos e alunas da graduação e da pós-graduação e com acompanhamento de professores da universidade, como a professora Silvana Tulesca, a professora Adriana Franco e o professor Fernando Mendonça. Dentre todas as atividades que são desenvolvidas pelo laboratório e pelo grupo de estudos, o projeto Entrevistas com os Clássicos da Psicologia Histórico-Cultural nasceu com o objetivo de retomar e reconstruir a história e a trajetória do desenvolvimento da psicologia histórico-cultural enquanto ciência e prática profissional. Diante disso, buscamos dialogar por meio de questões gerais, como autores clássicos, para registrar suas importantes e ricas contribuições que impactam nas discussões e análises atuais acerca da realidade concreta. E aqui a gente está com a primeira entrevista do projeto, e a gente conta com a brilhante participação do Karl Ratner, que é professor pela Humboldt University e diretor do Institute for Cultural Research and Education, na Califórnia, nos Estados Unidos. E a trajetória intelectual do Ratner remonta aos anos 1970, quando, a partir das propostas de psiquiatria, ele começou a discutir a necessidade de uma psicologia crítica e também estudar o marxismo com a finalidade de, inicialmente, construir uma psicologia dialética. Atualmente, o autor, a partir da obra do Vygotsky e das discussões no campo da psicologia cultural, defende a construção de uma psicologia macrocultural. Outras atividades e também alguns textos estão disponíveis na página pessoal do pesquisador e será disponível no link abaixo na descrição do vídeo. Boa entrevista para todos nós.
Okay, I understood most of that.
So now we're going to start the questions.
Okay.
The first one, can you tell us about your professional trajectory and your first contact with historical cultural psychology?
Mm-hmm. First, I wanted to thank you for all of these questions. I think they're very thoughtful questions, and it was enjoyable for me to think about them. And I realize how advanced your studies have been, in order to think of these kinds of questions. And I also wanted to tell you that you students are the luckiest students in the whole country of Brazil, because you have Fernando and Silvana and Adriana to be your teachers and your mentors and your colleagues. And they are just really wonderful people, and they're I think they have the deepest understanding of cultural historical psychology of all the people I've met in Brazil. I mean, obviously, there are a lot I haven't, but they just have a very clear understanding. I mean, from my point of view, they have a very clear understanding and very deep understanding, which is very difficult to achieve in these days, because there are a lot of distractions, and there's so many tendencies that are opposed to Marxism, or in a different direction from Marxism, that it's very easy for people to become distracted and to not really stay close to the principles of cultural historical psychology. So I think that you're going to get a excellent education. I just hope you can find a job afterwards. I don't know how students of cultural historical psychology do finding jobs, but if there are any, I think you'll have a very good understanding. And I also think that that it's very useful and very important for you to study this, not only to understand psychology, but because cultural historical psychology has so many implications and so many insights for contemporary social events that I think will help you to understand, the world and your country, much better. So actually, that's related to, to the question, because my encounter with cultural historical psychology was actually very interesting, because I encountered it in the early 1980s. But I had already had a strong political background before that, in the late 1960s and 1970s, when there was, the Cultural Revolution in the West. That was, very important for political reasons and economic reasons, and also social and social science reasons. And so there was this, huge political orientation and very left-wing orientation during that time. And so I was very fortunate in growing up in that time. And even before that, I want to teach you a word that you probably don't know, which is, do you ever hear the expression red diaper baby? Yeah? Oh, okay. Diaper baby, even before. So I had this long background in Marxism and Marxist social science. And actually, I had a very difficult time because I was studying psychology in graduate school. And then I got a job as a professor, but I didn't like contemporary psychology. And, I thought that it didn't have much to contribute to real life issues. And it certainly didn't have anything to contribute to improving the world. And so I got a PhD in psychology and I started teaching, but I didn't feel like I had any good psychological material to teach. But at that time, there was a lot of interest in sort of left-wing sociology and some discussion of sociology and how sociological conditions affect people's psychology. So the first couple of years I was teaching, I used that material. But then I was, my colleagues kept saying, well, Carl, where's all the psychological research, and all the psychological experiments and all those things? And so I was very worried in the 1970s of how I'm going to pursue a career in psychology, with my interest and my background. And then, fortunately, the works of Vygotsky started to be translated in the 1970s. And so I discovered those works, and I was really excited because I could really see that Vygotsky was using a Marxist approach to psychology. I mean, he says it, but in addition to saying it, I could see all of the Marxist concepts in his work, from my political background and from my research in social science, during that radical time in the US. And so I was really excited, and I thought, wow, here's something I can use, but also this is something that where I could make contact with other psychologists and really develop a progressive orientation to psychology using Vygotsky as the base. And so also at that time, other people were reading Vygotsky, and people were very excited. And there were some associations and some reading groups. And also at this time, there was an interest in cultural psychology that was started by psychological anthropologists. And they did very interesting research where they took anthropological research, but then they focused on the psychology of people in, diverse cultures. And so that was really the basis of cultural psychology. And so there were these psychological anthropologists who I was in touch with, and I actually joined the American Anthropological Association. And then Vygotsky came along, and some of the people in anthropology read Vygotsky, but also many psychologists started to read Vygotsky. And so I was very excited, and I thought, wow, this is going to be the basis of a whole new approach to psychology that will be both scientific and part of the discipline of psychology, but it will also have all of this progressive political concepts and implications. And so in the 1980s, I was really excited, and there were, I think, so that's when the cultural historical psychology movement started in the U.S., was in the 1980s. And one of the main places was Mike Cole's Laboratory of Human Cognition. You might have heard of that. At the University of California in San Diego. And he had actually learned Russian, and he went to the Soviet Union and studied with Luria. And so then he started this laboratory for human cognition that was based on Vygotsky and Luria's work. And so in the 1980s, when all of this was happening, I had a sabbatical from my university. And so I wrote to Cole, and I wrote to Jerome Bruner, who was also interested in Vygotsky. And I said, I have this sabbatical, and I'm this, little guy in Northern California interested in Vygotsky. Could I come and worship you for a year? Could I come and study with you and, participate in your discussions? And so Mike Cole said, yeah, that sounds wonderful. And so I spent 1 year at the laboratory with him. And then he had, he would invite, 6 or 7 scholars every year, to have discussions and things like that. So that was my encounter with cultural historical psychology. And like I said, I was very excited that this was going to be a whole new development in the field of psychology. And Vygotsky was really popular. And so, like I said, I had a lot of contact with all of these people. And this was all new for all psychologists, because Vygotsky hadn't been translated before. And so we all felt, very happy to meet each other, and, it was nice. Oh, you're interested in this also. And, everybody had, little different research interests that they had. And so at the beginning, it was very warm and very friendly. And I said, this is really good, because also the field of psychology is so individual, and it doesn't really pay much attention to social issues. And I said, this can be, very helpful in the society at large, and it can bring in social and political issues into psychology. And I thought that everybody would have the same feelings. So at first, we were all really friendly, but then I noticed that over the years, all of these American cultural historical psychologists were not really interested in Marxism. And first of all, most of them did not have any background in Marxism because most of them were academic psychologists. Like even Cole was an experimental psychologist. You know, he had no he didn't have any kind of social science orientation that was progressive or Marxist or anything like that. He was interested in Vygotsky mostly for cross-cultural purposes. And so I slowly found that actually very few people shared my Marxist interest in Vygotsky. And I was very disappointed because Vygotsky explicitly says that he wants to build a Marxist psychology, and he thinks that only a Marxist psychology is an adequate psychology. And so I said, this isn't, my point of view. Vygotsky said that psychology should follow the Marxist direction. I'm not saying it, he said it, and you're following him, but you're not following him because you're not talking about Marxism and you're really not interested in Marxism. And so in around the 1980s, I started to see all of these people. And by this time, there was like 5 or 6 or 7 years of research and conferences, and there was a lot of development of cultural historical psychology. And then I kept noticing that, it's very interesting that the work they did was also interesting, but I was especially interested in the political aspects that because it was so important, for American society at that time, and also because that's what Vygotsky emphasized. And so in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I started to become critical of the other Vygotskians, not personally, but just, for these reasons, because they weren't following the key points. And also, you have to remember that in the 1980s, there was still a lot of political activism, and there was feminism and, civil rights and Black liberation and all that stuff. And because they were not interested in the Marxist part of Vygotsky, they could not use cultural historical psychology to relate to the social movements. And so that was a big disappointment to me because, like I said, I was involved in the social movements before Vygotsky, before I read Vygotsky. And so over the years, I became, more critical. And of course, I think it's probably the same in Brazil, but in the US, once somebody starts to criticize you, you don't talk to them anymore. And is that how it is in Brazil too? And so they were not interested at all in my criticisms. And, I wasn't saying anything personal. I wasn't saying my point of view. I said, this is what Vygotsky's saying. And so from around the 1990s, I found that there were only, very few cultural historical psychologists who I thought were actually following the important part of Vygotsky. But, the other thousands of psychologists interested in Vygotsky were very interested in other parts of his work. I mean, they used his writings on education, very productively. And I thought that they did make a good contribution, in their areas. But I was concerned with cultural historical psychology as a comprehensive psychological theory that would not only explain human psychology, but would also improve human psychology by including all of these political issues that need to be considered. And so I did respect the work that they did in education, but I kept feeling that, they could go much deeper by including Vygotsky's more political comments. Like one of the comments he made in his book, Pedagogical Psychology, he said, the whole question of education in society can never be solved as long as there are social problems and contradictions in this social system. Imagine that. So that's exactly what I was looking for. That's what we were looking for in the 1970s, because that's saying that that good education requires a good society. And so, see, that's the connection between the politics and the social science. In order to be a good teacher and to do good pedagogy, you also have to be concerned with improving society. Otherwise, you can't make the educational reforms. And Vygotsky said that. And so I kept writing article after article, and I said, Vygotsky's saying that you have to change the society. So how did your work help to change society? And like I said, they just got angry and they said, oh, Carl, you're so critical and blah, 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 blah. And so my circle became much smaller. And then I discovered that Brazilian psychologists were the closest to, in Brazil, there were a lot of psychologists who did have a more political and Marxist approach. And so I started to spend more time in Brazil, and I met quite a number of the progressive Vygotskians and people who did have a political orientation to psychology. And so that's how I met Fernando and Silvana and your whole group, and people in other areas. And so in the more recent period, I felt that the Brazilian psychologists, or the Brazilian Vygotskians, were really had the best understanding of Vygotsky. And so so that's where I am now. And Americans have gotten further and further away from Marxism. And now you probably have heard of the ISCAR, the International Society for Cultural and Historical Research. And it was actually started by Mike Cole in San Diego and, people around him. And at the beginning, in the 1980s, at least those people read, they read some of Marx's works, just to understand what is Vygotsky talking about. But they never, they never used, Marxism in their work, but at least they studied Marxism and there was some discussion. But now, if you look at their journal, they have a journal called Mind, Culture, and Activity. It has absolutely nothing to do with broad social issues and nothing political, nothing Marxist. It's all about interpersonal, how are we going to improve education on an interpersonal level? And Mike Cole actually is very famous because he started some programs to help disadvantaged children, poor children, and he developed computer programs, to help them make certain associations and to do these little, cognitive tasks, which are interesting, but it has nothing to do with changing society. And most of the people, almost all of the Vygotskians, have a very interpersonal approach to Vygotsky and a very interpersonal approach to cultural and historical psychology. And I mean, of course, there's some use for that. As a teacher, you do have to pay some attention to interpersonal relations. But they, from what I can see, they have really abandoned any concern with the broad social system, with the political economy, with social class, anything like that. And it's all kind of the way education was a long time ago. Just teachers help students, and there are some interpersonal techniques and things like that. And that's what cultural historical psychology has become, certainly for the most part. And like, I'll give you one personal example. A couple of years ago, invited to give a keynote address there, and another guy was invited from Copenhagen, who is a very active member in the ISCAR, in the Cultural Historical Psychology group. And he came and he gave a talk. And of course, in my talk, I emphasized this statement from Vygotsky that to improve, to solve educational problems, it's necessary to solve social problems. And then this other guy came, and he's been had all kinds of leadership positions in the ISCAR group. And he came all the way from Copenhagen. And his main theme of his talk was that the way to improve education is to ensure universal education in Brazil. And the whole talk was about making education affordable and available, to all children of all social classes, all incomes. And so this guy is a major representative of cultural historical psychology. And so he gave his talk, I gave my talk, and then there was some discussion. And so I said, well, I have a comment about, his name was Seth. I said, about Seth's presentation. I said, of course, universal education is necessary, but universal education is a very ambiguous and abstract phrase because it doesn't specify any content. So I said, neoliberals can say, we are going to make neoliberal education universal. And then they would fit into Seth's requirements. And I said, so your requirement is so abstract that people can meet your requirement. People can say, yeah, we're for universal education also, but the education that they practice is very conservative education, and neoliberal education has been demonstrated to be a very terrible approach to education. So I said, here you are, a leading member of the Cultural Historical Psychology group, and you are opening the door to the worst form of education, which is neoliberal education. And anybody who practices neoliberal education can say, yeah, I'm a cultural historical psychologist because I also support universal education. So I said, look, I'm just trying to explain to you how important it is to make politics central to your social science research, and how important it is to make politics central to your educational research. If you don't specify the politics, then you're welcoming neoliberal education. And I said, that is, obviously that's a terrible approach to take. And so that's a personal example, just a couple of years ago, of the difference between my approach, and I think Vygotsky's approach to education, and what has happened to education now with these cultural historical psychologists. And my call is the same thing. You know, they don't talk about these concrete political issues. So, of course, after I gave my little critique, and first I said, you know, I'm not trying to say that, you know, Seth is I'm not trying to criticize him personally. You know, I'm trying to explain the different approach to cultural historical psychology and what I think is a problem. That's all. And so then he said, well, okay, I'd like to respond to Carl. And so his response was, it's very important for us, very important for Brazilian psychologists to have universal education. And he just said the same thing again and again. And he mentioned some other, you know, famous Western educators who also said it's very important to have universal education. And he never said one word about my criticism, not one word. It's like I didn't say anything. And so this is like a personal example that happened in Brazil. And of course, most of the people in the audience afterwards went up to him. Oh, yeah, at the end, most of the people in the audience, and this was the keynote, you know, address. So all the people at the conference were there. And a lot of people said, oh, they said to him, Seth, we learned so much from you, and your speech was so inspiring and everything. And then one person said, but you know, in Brazil, we already have universal education. So that example kind of sums up my relation with cultural historical psychology now. And so what I've done most recently is I've tried to introduce cultural historical psychology to Marxist scholars, because there are lots of Marxist journals, you know, and you know, people are interested in Marxist theory. And so I'm now introducing Vygotsky's Marxist psychology to Marxists, because I think that even though Vygotsky was a psychologist, my thinking is that Marxists would be more receptive to Vygotsky's writings because of his Marxism than psychologists are. And, or at least Marxists would be more receptive to the Marxist points of Vygotsky's work. So that's what I've done. And I've kind of reduced my interaction with the North American, you know, European cultural historical psychologists. And, you know, now what's happened with all of this kind of postmodern orientation is that a lot of cultural historical psychologists really reject Vygotsky's Marxist principles. And before, I thought they were just ignoring them because they were more interested in the interpersonal stuff. But now there's a lot of rejection because they say that Vygotsky didn't emphasize individual agency enough, and you know, those kinds of points that are very popular now. So, like I said, I feel now, I mean, this is all, you know, my opinion. Other people will have different opinions. But my opinion now is that cultural historical psychology, at least in the North American part, I'm not talking about Brazil, I think that it's you know, in a very sad situation now.
So can we go to the second one?
Okay.
In your point of view, How does historical cultural psychology differ from other theoretical approaches within psychology?
Well, the way Vygotsky designed it, it's extremely difficult. It's extremely different because of all the things I was saying, that he's trying to bring in Marxist historical materialist concepts. And there's no psychologists who have any understanding of that. And there are no psychologists who have any interest in that. They don't even know what historical materialism is. And another thing that Vygotsky said is that he said that that cultural historical psychology, well, he said that all psychology should integrate human psychology into historical materialist principles. Isn't that amazing? And there's nobody in the world who has ever quoted that. I have never seen it in any writings about Vygotsky. But obviously that's a totally different approach to psychology. That psychology, just like the example of education, good education has to be integrated into a concept of a good society. And most educators don't have that concept. You know, they think that education should be to help children to learn material and to make it, you know, efficient and to make it understandable and to give students self-confidence and, you know, those kinds of things, which are very nice. But it has nothing to do with creating a socialist country and a socialist, you know, political economy. So that was one of the things that attracted me to Vygotsky, that he was so different and he was so principled about combining political improvement with psychological improvement. And so I think that that's really the main difference, that he is very profoundly and very fundamentally political and socialist, you know, in his perspective. And that's exactly why. And so, see, I thought that all these psychologists and educators would become more Marxist as they read Vygotsky, because Vygotsky says this all the time, you know, that you have to understand Marxism and you have to understand, you know, our goal is socialism and all this. So I said, oh, all these psychologists are now going to read Marx to find out what is Marxism, what is socialism, what is historical materialism. But nobody did. So conceptually, I think if you're being true to Vygotsky, and if you're really following Vygotsky, then these things, these political things, are enormously different, you know, from the standard psychology and standard education. But, you know, the fact is that now very few people have pursued and have developed this different approach. So now when you read educators, when you read Vygotskyan educators, you can't see anything in their work that's different from the mainstream. You know, it's just a little bit different. Like if you look at Mike Cole's computer games to help school children to learn things, there's absolutely nothing that's different from mainstream, you know, cognitive approaches to education. And so now I don't think there really is a difference. between cultural historical psychology and any other psychology. And like I said, I gave the example of the universal education. I mean, you know, it sounds really nice. It sounds great. All kids should have education. But if you don't specify what kind of education, then you're opening the door to all kinds of terrible, you know, to a lot of dangers. And that's exactly what they do. I mean, again, that's my point of view. I suppose if you talk to, you know, to this guy Seth, for example, or other people, they would say, "Oh, yeah, you know, it's very different." But then just ask, in what ways is it different? And I don't think they could find any real differences. So, I mean, that's kind of a short answer, but I mean, I think the basic idea is that in Vygotsky, there's a tremendous difference between his approach and other psychologies. But the fact is that now all those differences, I think, have been very much lost. That's what I think. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how it is in Brazil, but I think it'd be very interesting to, examine the cultural historical psychologists and educators in Brazil and actually look at their recommendations for improving education or for improving psychology, or look at their psychological concepts and see if there is a significant difference between their work and the mainstream. I mean, it'd be an interesting, little study for you guys to do, to see whether cultural historical psychology in Brazil is significantly different from the mainstream.
The third one, okay. What contributions does historical cultural psychology bring to the understanding of the human psyche? What do you consider essential to guide the psychologist's work?
I think that that's a very big question because, as you know, Vygotsky, well, first of all, Marxism itself involves many, many different elements and many different dimensions. I mean, if you think about Marxism, you could think about things like social class, you could think about exploitation, you could also think about dialectics, and you can also think about Hegel. And, there are some very abstract and theoretical aspects to Marxism, and then there are some very specific ones, like Marx's analysis of capital and, things like that. And I think the same thing is true about cultural historical psychology. That Vygotsky took the same approach. I mean, he wrote a lot about dialectical, issues and dialectical relationships, and how the dialectical relation between, say, speech and thought, and there are some, very kind of general human nature issues in cultural historical psychology like that, like what's the relation between psychology and language, that kind of thing. So that's a big part of Vygotsky, and also Vygotsky has a lot of specific writings about education, for example, that education should not be authoritarian, and those are the things that the other cultural historical psychologists took from Vygotsky. And like I keep saying, there's certainly those things are certainly part of cultural historical psychology. It's just that I think that Vygotsky talked about those things, but he also related them to these other things like historical materialism and the political system that you're living in and those kinds of things. And so I think that there are all these different levels to cultural historical psychology. And if you really, and of course, all the different levels are interrelated. You know, when Vygotsky talks about historical materialism, it's not just it's not just, you know, historical materialism as a separate theory. It's also tied in with understanding dialectical relationships between things, you know. So I think it's just like Marx. If you want to understand Marx, you have to understand the general philosophical issues, you know, his critique of Hegel, you know, his critique of everybody else who ever lived. And, you know, all of the theories and the philosophies and the idealism and, you know, all the things that he talked about. But then there's also the other stuff. There's the alienation of capitalism, you know, and exploitation and all of that. So if you want to say that you really understand Marx, obviously you have to understand all those interconnected things. And I think the same thing is true of Vygotsky. But now I'm finishing up another book where I go through Vygotsky's works, and in my previous works, I would emphasize that, you know, Vygotsky talked about all of these, you know, political and Marxist points. But in this last book, I think I took a more refined approach, and I showed that whenever Vygotsky talked about a specific psychological issue, like the development of cognition in children, that seems to be one of those, you know, more general human nature kinds of things. But in every single case that I examined, when he talked about those abstract general issues, he also talked about how important it is that in the cognitive development of children, their whole cognitive development totally depends upon the nature of the social system that they live in. And so these are not, you know, separate issues that I think that if you read Vygotsky carefully, you can find the political issues in all of the theoretical issues, all of the interpersonal issues, all of the educational issues. And it seems to me that's an interesting way to look at Vygotsky. You know, I think the most cultural historical psychologists say, well, Vygotsky was very diverse, you know, and he had many, he was sick for a lot of his life, and he didn't have time to write things very carefully, and he didn't have time to write very thoroughly. And so he talks a little about education, he talks a little about dialectics, he talks about interpersonal relations, he talks about the zone of proximal development, and he also talks about politics. But I'm finding that these are not separate issues that he wrote at, you know, different times, that these are all very integrated for him. And like I said, when it's amazing that he talks about the cognitive development of children, you know, 5, 6 years old, and then he'll stick in a paragraph and he says, but of course, these processes all depend on the particular kind of political economic system that the children are living in. And no one ever talks about that. So that's the kind of thing that I am working on. But, you know, that's all because I had this interest, you know, from a long time ago. of trying to understand this relation between the psychology and the politics and the Marxism and stuff. So I think all of those, I mean, I think that all these different issues in historical psychology actually are very integrated. It's not like, you know, he was working on something and he got tuberculosis, and then he worked on something else. I don't think it's like that. I think that he was always thinking about these things together, and he didn't always write about them extensively together. But I mean, it's just amazing to me to find these paragraphs in everywhere. And so in my latest book, I have a chapter on Vygotsky's, you know, psychology, where I show that actually all of the psychological things are really preparation for, I mean, that he frames psychological questions in terms that are acceptable to a political understanding. So I don't know, it's hard to explain it briefly, but that's what I think is what's very distinctive about him. But see, the interesting thing is that because he talked about so many different things, all these different Vygotskians can say, well, I'm a Vygotskian because he talks about, you know, X, and I'm a Vygotskian because he talks about Y, and I'm a Vygotskian because he talks about Z. So it is easy to lose sight of the integration, because it's true, you know, he wrote quickly and he only had 10 years to write. But I think if you look more deeply, all these things have a very integral connection, and it's really interesting to see it, you know, if you look for them.
Well, I would like to read your book. What gaps still exist for new research scholars to advance in the development of historical cultural psychology today?
I think that there are gaps because most of the Vygotskians have not understood the integration of all of these issues that we've been talking about. And they treat these issues differently. And so if you look at the people who do educational research, they emphasize certain aspects of his writing. And then there are people who, like I have a friend who is interested in language, but in learning foreign language and the psychology of learning foreign language. And so he uses Vygotsky because Vygotsky emphasizes language, you know, for thinking and for human psychology. So I forgot what I was going to say, but so I think the gaps are trying to integrate these things together, and also for trying to establish the relation of all of his specific ideas to Marxist principles of, say, historical materialism. I mean, that's a huge gap, and nobody has really done that. Like, for example, if you might know from looking at my Vita that recently I wrote a book on neoliberal psychology, and I used Vygotsky's cultural historical psychology as explanatory concepts for understanding neoliberal psychology. And I think that his concepts help to clarify the relation between neoliberalism and psychology. And so, because, you know, again, I was very interested in applying historical materialism to human psychology, because that's what Vygotsky said we need to do. And so I said, well, neoliberalism is a huge social issue. It has enormous effects on, social life. And so it seems to me this is, a perfect example of historical materialism applied to psychology. So I used historical materialism to analyze neoliberalism, and then I gave examples of human psychology that's been affected by neoliberalism. So it seems to me that's a kind of gap that psychologists, could pursue. I mean, there are millions of, issues going on now, and like terrorism or, fascism. And so how do all of these things affect human psychology? Are Brazilian people, is their psychology becoming more fascist? Is there something we could call a fascist psychology? I mean, that would be interesting. And it's not just how people think, but like Trump is the most amazing phenomenon because he is one of the most evil people in human history. And he has so much support and so much worship, from people. I mean, it's unbelievable what this guy was able to do. And so cultural historical psychologists should be studying that. They should be studying why in the world would anybody follow this guy? I mean, everything he says is a lie. Everything. I mean, he never tells the truth. There were books, that list in 1 week he lied 15,000 times in public. And people follow this stuff. And let me ask you, now with the COVID, is there resistance to vaccines in Brazil? Yeah, just like here.
Vamos que vamos, vou traçando vários planos, vou seguir cantarolando pra poder contra-atacar. Contra-atacar, contra-atacar, eu vou traçando vários planos pra poder contra-atacar. Contra-atacar, contra-atacar, traçando vários planos pra poder contra-atacar. Contra-atacar, contra-atacar, eu vou traçando vários planos pra poder contra-atacar. Contra-atacar, contra-atacar, eu vou traçando vários planos. Nas veias abertas da América Latina tem fogo cruzado queimando nas